Welcome to Massey College. I'm Nathalie Derosier, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the cherished land of the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and are grateful for the ability of all of us to be here together to reflect on some of the big issues of our times. And certainly today, we're going to reflect on some incredibly important issues about the role of the media. The Press Club is a tradition at Massey College, and I want to thank all of our participants and particularly the audience for being here again on YouTube and participating in the reflections of the crucial issues of our time. This is what Massey does, and I think we're grateful for your continued engagement in these issues. The Journalism Fellowship has been an integral part of Massey College and the University of Toronto since 1963. And over 250 international and Canadian journalists have been participating in this program. So we continue to support the program because we believe in the role of the media. It's incredible importance for our democracy and for our society. So we are grateful, obviously, to the Alba Foundation, the estate of the late Sinclair Balfour, Lisa Balfour Bowen, and the late Walter Bowen, Claire Balfour, Marcy McDonald, Wilson Southam, and the Howard Webster Foundation, the G.W. McConnell Family Foundation, CBC and Radio-Canada, McLaughlin Centers, and the generosity of many, many past journalism fellows. And I hope this continues. Massey College believes in the media. It continues to be committed to its leadership role in our society. And today, I think we have the best panel ever to confront these big issues. So it's my pleasure to introduce Duncan Mccue, your moderator for the evening. Duncan Mccue is known to all of us. He's an award-winning journalist. He's the host of CBC Radio 1 Cross Country Checkup. He's a correspondent for the National and CBC TV. And he teaches journalism at UBC Graduate School of Journalism in Ryerson. And he was recognized so many times for his great leadership in really engaging a curriculum driven for Indigenous scholars and Indigenous journalists. So he was recognized by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association with an Innovation Award for developing curriculum on Indigenous issues, awarded the Knight Fellowship at Stanford in 2011, and he created an online guide for journalists. He's Anishinaabe, and he's a proud member of the Chippewas of Georgina Islands First Nation in Ontario, and it's such a great pleasure to have him, a great member of the Massey community. Duncan.
Oh, miigwech, Nathalie, miigwech. Ani, bonjour, Kinewea, Bindigan, Massey College Press Club, Onquadance Indigenous Kas, Maingan, Dodem, Chippewas of Georgina Island, and Doonjaba. Thank you, Nathalie, for that very kind introduction. And I just introduced myself the way that's customary amongst my people to describe our name and our clan and the community that we are from. I echo Nathalie in saying that we've just got an outstanding panel this evening of people who are volunteering their time and their expertise to tackle this really important critical question, timely question about objectivity in the Canadian media in the wake of the events of this summer in Black Lives Matter. And so I want to introduce them all just briefly. The people in the boxes there that are joining us. Anita Lee is a co-founder of Canadian Journalists of Color. Jeffrey Dvorkin is a senior fellow at Massey College and the former director of journalism at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. Rachel Giza is the editorial director of Extra magazine and an accomplished author. And Adrian Harewood is the co-anchor of CBC News Ottawa, and they are joining us all from their various homes, as is the as is the practice nowadays during this pandemic. So welcome to you all. Thank you for making time for joining us. I just want to say to our audience that's joining us, it was just a beautiful day here in Toronto. I wanted to emphasize that because my friends in Vancouver are always saying, "Oh, look how nice and warm it is in Vancouver during the Toronto winters." Well, I just have to say to you poor folks out west who are watching us, I'm sorry about your weather, but it was just gorgeous here in Toronto today. So I wanted to emphasize that. But to our audience, we'd love to hear from you on this topic. So we will open up our feed in about a half an hour's time. I'll let you know when our chat will be open and you can fire off questions. And a little bit like an episode of Cross Country Checkup, I'll do my best to work your questions to the panelists in as we go along. And I also want to let you know that if you want to share this with anybody afterwards, Massey College has an outstanding YouTube channel where we post a lot of our discussions and talks. And so go check out Massey College YouTube and you can share that link. This will be posted afterwards. So our discussion, 2020 will be remembered in many ways, but in the world of journalism, it may be remembered as the year that objectivity broke away from the discussions in journalism classrooms and made it into the mainstream conversation. So we thought it was important that we talk about how the notion of objectivity is evolving in Canadian media. And I wondered if I could just start with a real quick lightning round with everybody here, just so that we get a sense. Here's a loaded question, but if you can keep it short and simple, is it possible for a journalist to be objective? Rachel, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Thank you. I think for me, it's not possible because I'm not sure that objectivity is the goal that we should be aiming for. And real quick, there's a quote that I like from a journalist named Ramona Martinez. She is the producer of a podcast called The View from Somewhere, which looks at objectivity at journalism. And her line is, "Objectivity is the ideology of the status quo." And I really, really like that quote because I think it really speaks to the sort of the myth at the center of objectivity.
Jeffrey, is it possible for a journalist to be objective?
I don't think it is, and I don't think it should be. I think the purpose of journalism is to create a kind of an honest understanding of events. And as Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel have said in their great book, The Elements of Journalism, you have to bring your conscience into the newsroom with you. You can't leave it out on the street.
I'd say that I don't think it's possible to dispense with your, subjectivity. So I don't think it's possible for a human being to be objective. So no, I don't think it's possible for a journalist.
And then Anita, what about you? What are your thoughts on this?
My short answer is no. You can be fair, accurate, rigorous as a journalist, but no one journalist can really be objective.
Okay, so here's this was a bit of a trick question, actually, because we hadn't discussed this. The panelists hadn't discussed this before. My assumption was that you were all going to answer no, that it was not possible for a journalist to be objective. Yet, it is perhaps one of the most important norms, I'll call it a norm, or principles of contemporary newsrooms, is this notion of objectivity. So I wondered if we could get a sense before we embark on what objectivity means, and perhaps, as some of you are hinting, what it needs to start to change toward. Jeffrey, can you give us just a thumbnail sketch of where this notion of objectivity in journalism evolved from?
I think it began in the United States when newspapers started to become true mass media after World War I. And some of the thinkers around these things, including not Walter Kaufman,
Lippmann.
Lippmann, sorry, yeah, Walter Lippmann, thank you. Walter Lippmann very highly influenced by Sigmund Freud, felt that World War I, the media had allowed people to believe that they needed to go off and be slaughtered in order to save civilization. And Lippmann said, we need smarter journalism to help guide people. And this means, first of all, creating a more, quote, objective kind of newspapering, but also a leadership among the thinkers in news organizations. And from that emerged a very powerful rationalization for the status quo, if anything. And it also had a very strong anti-labor, anti-trade union vibe after World War I, as the Russian Revolution came about and the ideas of communism spread, and unions started forming, especially in news organizations. And the people who led those news organizations, both in print and broadcasting, said, no, we have to have standards. We have to control this. Otherwise, we could have a revolution. And so that kind of struggle between the people who run news organizations and the people who work for news organizations ebbed and flowed over the years. And I think what we're seeing now is, through the digital culture, an emergence of a more powerful resistance journalism, as the younger journalists in many newsrooms are calling themselves. They want news with an edge. They want news that draws conclusions. And you have an older cohort of journalists and managers who never were raised with those values. So now we have this generation gap inside many news organizations, the CBC, the Toronto Star, public radio in the United States, the Wall Street Journal. It is now an issue of, can you balance the need for a kind of a moral principle in journalism with the idea that there have to be some kind of accepted shared standards? And so that's where we're back to 1918.
Okay, so thank you for that. And let me take that as a segue to ask Adrian, because Jeffrey has kind of framed it as a discussion about more traditional forms of journalism versus a resistance journalism. Certainly, it was some of the Black journalists in the United States who were leading this conversation this summer. New York Times newsroom, for example, the LA Times. Can you give us a sense of what the critique has been amongst some of the Black journalists in those newsrooms of objectivity and how it's harming journalism?
You know, I'm going to get to that, but I just want to preface something. I just want to add something to what Jeffrey was saying, because I think objectivity in the 20s was also about scientific method, right? So I think it was also about trying to make journalism more scientific, more rigorous, and it was a kind of a pursuit of a certain kind of legitimacy as well, right? So that was, I think that was part of the idea, and it's not a bad idea of being more rigorous. It's not a bad idea to be more transparent. I think the argument from Black journalists has been, but some Black journalists has been that objectivity has been used as a kind of a cudgel. And it's been used and it's been used to kind of make the argument that journalism is above the fray, that it is this kind of view from nowhere, that it is neutral. There's a notion of journalism, objectivity being a sign of journalism's neutrality. It's strive for balance. But from our perspective, we've actually seen how newsrooms have operated. We've seen the decisions that are made around, what subjects are covered, what kind of questions are asked, what questions aren't asked. I recently spoke with a colleague who told me that a senior colleague, and I won't name the organization that she's attached to, but she had her she hoped to cover the George Floyd protests in the United States. And she was told that because of her Blackness, because of her race, she could not be objective, right? That somehow the fact that she was Black and she would be covering Black people somehow tainted her and prevented her from being able to cover the story with the kind of lucidity and the kind of rationality that was required. Now, this Black journalist would say, and she would say, well, if a white journalist were sent into the fray, why are they considered to be objective? What is there something inherently objective about being white? Does it give you a particular kind of ability to see or to kind of assess things? So I think that's part of what the argument has been.
Anita, if I could go, I saw you nodding when Adrian was describing that scenario. What do you think forms the basis, I guess, of the current critique about objectivity?
Well, I would say that objectivity actually prevents journalists from doing their work in a more thoughtful way. It doesn't, because of this kind of, I've actually had other fellow journalists say that they wouldn't vote because they feel like any sort of act where they were taking a stand on an issue would actually prevent them from properly reporting on an issue. But in fact, that's the opposite. We need greater interrogation of concepts and systems and more of an engagement with the issues around us. And objectivity actually prevents journalists from really engaging with the world around them, because they're really just kind of at the end looking. I remember actually being a general assignment reporter when I first started, and it was about getting one side of the story or the other. But as all of us know on this panel, that society and life contains multitudes, and the truth is not just easily dissected or easily kind of divided between one side or the other. And so I actually think it does an ultimate disservice to our industry and the way we, and also a disservice to the public, frankly, when we really hold on to these antiquated notions of objectivity that don't exist in reality. Truth is not objectivity.
Rachel, if I could pick up on that, I mean, Anita's point that her concern is that objectivity does a disservice to our audience. If you go back to what Adrian was saying, that the whole idea of objectivity was to bring in a scientific method, if you will, to try to have some rigorous standards of truth telling, and that the idea of objectivity is so some of the words that I've heard you already use this evening, I mean, in terms of fairness and impartiality and being unbiased, all of those things were to try to get toward fact, right? To have some sort of way of actually improving our credibility with our audiences. But yet you say that this view from nowhere, as it's been called, is problematic. Why? Where have journalists gone wrong in the way that they've applied to objectivity?
Well, I think to pick up on what Adrian said, there is no nowhere. But what's happened is there's been a default. So the dominant view, people who are the dominant population, who have the most, the most power, the most clout, become the view from nowhere. So we assume that point of view of, the traditional model of, the older white man with the salt and pepper hair behind the news desk is somehow I see you, Jeffrey, is somehow neutral. But of course, that perspective is also shaped by culture, experience, the way that person walks through the world. So I think in calling something objective, you are actually calling something with a viewpoint objective. So then the whole needle is off, because you've said that there's a default view alongside which everyone else deviates, when in fact that default view is itself informed by by life experience, by viewpoints, and by interests. I mean, I think what, when we talk about the history of journalism, most of the early newspapers had very powerful interests in mind. They were owned by industrialists. They were owned by political parties. They had a strong agenda. For me, I have spent a big chunk of my career working in community journalism or movement journalism. Jeffrey talked about resistance journalism. People also can refer to it as movement journalism. I run a publication for the LGBTQ2S community. We were formed, a long time ago because folks in our communities were not covered at all, or when we were covered in ways that were steeped in prejudice and in bias. And other communities likewise. There's a strong tradition of African-American newspapers in the US and here in Canada as well. Jewish newspapers, on and on it goes. Publications for women, publications for certain movements. I think, and I'll wrap this up because I'm being long-winded, but I think to pick up on what Anita says about how objectivity can do a disservice is I think that one of the things that has become very dangerous that people have pointed out, particularly in the Trump years, but it existed beforehand, is the other side-ism, is when people talk about the news needing to be fair and balanced. And often in the balance, you're finding false equivalence. You have newsrooms that are so desperate to not appear biased that you suddenly find yourself, lots of folks find themselves on panels debating their own humanity. I'm old enough to have been on panels in the 90s debating about same-sex marriage and sort of being on a panel where the thrust of it was, the opposite of gay rights is someone who's very hateful. And I think that probably everyone on this panel has been a part of some such thing where often you find as a journalist, if you are not part of the dominant culture, you are often in a position where you are having to make a case for your own humanity, or you are being asked to produce a panel where you have people having to make the case that they're having to argue for humanity. So I think I'll leave it at that, but that's what I just wanted to pick up on what Anita said about it does do a disservice.
Jeffrey, if I could shift the conversation, you mentioned Tom Rosenstiel, who has written, kind of the textbook on journalism in the United States. Adrian retweeted one of Tom's tweets today, which was a lengthy Twitter kind of essay on this very topic. And if I could read one of the tweets in it to you, I'm just curious what your reaction would be. If journalists replace a flawed understanding of objectivity by taking refuge in subjectivity and think their opinions have more moral integrity than general inquiry, journalism will be lost. And I recognize it's a bit difficult to when I'm just reading that to you, but I mean he was making an effort to make the case for objectivity in some ways. What do you make of that argument?
Well, full disclosure, I worked for Tom and Bill Kovich for a year as the executive director of something called the Committee of Concerned Journalists. We were concerned, but we ran out of money, so we kind of had to fold and do other things. And I know exactly what Rosenstiel and Kovich were talking about, which was this idea that there has to be a way of integrating your personal experiences, your knowledge, your values, your deepest feelings in order to make your journalism more relevant and effective. He's a great believer, I think, I hope I'm getting this right, is that Tom does not believe that journalism is done in some kind of sterile test tube conditions. We are human, we are fallible. Journalism is a human endeavor. It will get things right, it'll get things wrong, but it has to make the effort to try to get it right and to get it contextually correct. And I think that's what he's saying. I think the challenge for us is, as older journalists, younger journalists, still active journalists. How do we manage to bring those two dichotomies together so that news organizations can take advantage in the best sense of what the people who work there have to offer? And I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that the idea of objectivity is not something that you hear very often inside a news organization. I mean, I've worked at CBC and started at CBS in London when I was a grad student, and then NPR most recently. I never heard anybody, never one boss say, I don't think your reporting is objective. They would criticize the reporting for missing an angle, not taking something to its logical conclusion. But the whole idea of objectivity comes from the more conservative values in our society, certainly in the US and the UK and in Canada as well, to a lesser extent. Bill Kristol, who's a very smart, very conservative commentator on these matters, came onto an NPR program, a version of Cross Country Checkup, and attacked the media in general and NPR in particular for bias. Well, bias is where we go into a defensive crouch because we don't want to be accused of being biased. And I listened to him. I was in the newsroom or in the studio when this was going on. I walked him out of the building and I said, Mr. Kristol, you don't really believe that the media has a liberal bias? And he said, of course not. You do a great job. We only say that to keep you on the defensive. And I think that once we start arguing about whether journalism is objective or not, we've suddenly moved the terrain onto that area where conservative critics, conservative media critics would rather have us be, because we would be on the defensive at all times. And I think we also have to find a way of being much more, well, aggressive and not defensive about the job that we do as journalists and who we do it for.
Let me, I can speak as a CBC journalist, and Adrian, I'm sure you're very familiar. Charges of bias thrown at my direction every day. That's not an uncommon thing for journalists to hear that. But if I could pick up on a point that you were saying, Jeffrey, you're saying that objectivity is not something that's discussed in the newsrooms. Yet Adrian raised the point of a Black journalist who was questioned about her objectivity, and there was an article written by former CBC journalist Pasant Matar that was published in Walrus magazine this summer. Which suggested that objectivity is a privilege that's afforded only to white journalists. That objectivity, that BIPOC journalists are constantly being asked about their objectivity. Is that a fair statement by Pasant Matar, Adrian?
Well, I think there's some merit to it. I think that there's some merit to it. I think that we need to recognize subjectivity, or one's subjectivity, as actually being an asset, right? So the kind of life experiences that you have, the way in which you've moved through the world can help to inform your journalistic practice and can actually help you to ask sometimes questions that are a little bit deeper, questions that perhaps a person who doesn't have that particular experience might be unable to ask. Sometimes one's subjectivity also enables one to engage with communities in particular kinds of ways. It can kind of give you a certain kind of credibility that allows you in and that allows you to kind of better explore the realities that people are having to endure. So, I think that sometimes media organizations fail to recognize the asset the assets that they actually have in their midst, and the failure to kind of exploit those assets is a real tragedy. Actually, it's quite unfortunate.
I'll let our audience know that all the panelists have agreed they'd be happy to hear your questions. If you've got any questions about objectivity, and so fire them off, and I'll do my best to share a few of them with the panelists. I wonder, Rachel, you're raising the point about the diversity of the newsroom. How willing, and you know, kind of, if you go back to the growth, the founding of Extra, it was because of some of the homophobic viewpoints that were being expressed in the mainstream media in the 80s and at that time. Is it possible to have this conversation about objectivity without, you know, looking at the accuracy of our newsrooms, how accurately our newsrooms are reflecting our population in the country?
Yeah, I want to get to that, but I saw, Anita, you had your hand up earlier, and I don't know
Sorry,
if
I
you
missed
had
it.
like a pressing thought. So did you want to chime in now, and then I can answer your question, Duncan, after?
Thanks, Rachel. That's really thoughtful and considerate of you. Yes, I did have a pressing thought that I'd like to get to. Just in response to the quote that Duncan was sharing with Jeffrey, I actually think, no disrespect to that person, but I actually think that actually points to some degree of binary thinking, and it points to a lack of imagination, in fact, because like some of my fellow panelists said, even the discussion about objectivity isn't a binary conversation. And there's a lot of ways that you can bring your subjective self to journalism while also being transparent about that in order to gain and regain the trust, frankly, of the public, a news consuming public that is, like a lot of establishment news organizations that do practice objectivity, have lost. And also that notion where, you know, the notion that he says, if we all kind of bring our own individual moral judgments and moral superiority to news, that it'll be the downfall of like the news industry, I think is so, I mean, I think it's alarmism, because we have to remember that journalism and media is a pillar of democracy. And in this country, we defend values of multiculturalism, human rights, you know, equality in this country. And so those are the kind of values that I bring to the table when I'm doing journalism. And that's always in the back of my mind, not, you know, simple ideas of balance and objectivity. It's really, is this serving our country's democratic values? It seems quite straightforward to me.
Thank you, Anita. Sorry, I missed your hand earlier. Rachel, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's sort of picking up on some similar themes about like who's in the newsroom and who's around the table, which I think these need to be conversations held every day, all the time, as, you know, constant questions when people are generating story ideas, when people are doing the business of news. Who's absent? Who's absent? Whose viewpoint is absent in this room? I think that, you know, I would agree with Anita that I think this binary thinking, that if you approach something with subjectivity, that means that you are automatically lacking rigor. I think some of the finest journalists who have the greatest degree of rigor and credibility in their reporting are people who come at something with a stake in it. That, you know, I think about that list that just got released of some of the, you know, the best reported stories. I can't remember what in the last couple of decades. You know, one of the pieces was Ta-Nehisi Coates's major opus, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic. I mean, the fact that there is a subjectivity is right there in the display, The Case for Reparations. He is making the case for reparations in America. That piece is deeply, deeply reported. So I think it's possible to write journalism, to be a journalist in a way that brings, that you are trying to persuade or clarify, but you are also bringing your reporting to it. You know, in my newsroom, you know, not all of our contributors are LGBTQ2S, but they are all expected to bring a cultural competency. I assume that if someone is going out and covering trans issues, they don't necessarily have to be a trans person, but they have to understand those issues. They can't go into it ignorant of context, of background. They can't just be discovering these issues, you know, fresh. I think that there's a real merit to having people with expertise on certain issues, with a sightline on certain issues, where, like Adrian said, they become an asset, somebody who maybe can build more trust more quickly in a particular community because they speak that language. They're familiar with cultural traditions when they enter into a community. I think that journalist is likely to have a way to build trust more quickly, to understand, hey, wait a second, that's not really ringing correct to me. And it's not ringing correct because I'm familiar with these issues. So I actually think that acknowledging subjectivity, that having newsrooms that more represent everyone who is part of our intended audience or our desired audience means you just have stronger reporting. You have more people who can say, you know, you bought that because that's not true. Like, I know what's going on there, and you bought that line, or you believe that to be true when you have people who can check those biases. So I think that there's always an ability to marry subjectivity with rigor and credibility.
Let me pick up on that, Rachel. You talked about having a trans reporter covering a trans story, or a trans issue, and it not, from your perspective, it not necessarily being necessary. Anita, if I could ask you, one of the CAJ Toronto retweeted our talk this evening and asked the question: should Indigenous journalists be chosen to go and cover an Indigenous land protest, for example, a blockade? Yes or no? I mean, is that a question that you've been wrestling with at all?
I don't. It's something that comes up in classes that I teach, in journalism classes that I teach. But my biggest concern actually is polarization. And we can't get things done as a collective society and tackle pressing issues like the climate crisis if we don't come together and empathize and understand each other. And I think just saying like this person from this community, only people from this particular community are allowed to cover issues in that community would be a disservice again to journalism practitioners as well as members of the public. And you lose an opportunity to be able to understand another community and build bridges. So I actually think what needs to be done in newsrooms is that, first of all, we definitely need to diversify newsrooms in all respects, and hire more staff from underrepresented communities, but also leverage the expertise and the cultural competency of those staff members and have them connect with other members in the newsroom and help educate the other folks. Yeah, I think the bridge building starts within newsrooms, and then we're going to start to see it in the general public, because as journalists, we actually provide the language and the framework for how, families, our friends and families and loved ones have conversations about the most pressing topics of the day during dinner. Like, we provide the language, we provide the framework. So if we're, that's another thing where if you are too focused on binary conversations, that's the kind of conversations that will result among the public.
I find it interesting that you share that. You talk about bridge building, because it's been my approach as I've taught a course at UBC for a decade now called Reporting in Indigenous Communities, which has actually had very few Indigenous students in it. But my philosophy has always been in that course, much like Rachel pointed out, that a reporter should have some sort of cultural competency, but the color of their skin or their racial heritage or however you want to describe it shouldn't really matter, so long as they have that cultural competency. Jeffrey, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting that on the one hand, we can't just send white evangelicals to cover politics in South Florida. You want to have a broader approach to that. At NPR, there was a story involving the leader of the Klan in North Carolina, who was having some kind of open house to explain Klanism to the public. And we had a long discussion about, should we cover it? Are we giving oxygen to this guy? Why are we doing this? Why is he doing it? And we decided, after a long discussion, that we would cover it. But who do we send to cover it? And a very fine African-American woman, Brenda Wilson, said, I'll go. And so we were, of course, a little nervous, for all the usual managerial reasons of will she be safe? We never doubted that she could do the story because she had that asset, she had that competence. And so she went and she interviewed this leader of the Klan in North Carolina, came back with an amazing story, and the man basically destroyed himself with his own mouth. She didn't have to argue. She just presented him as the idiot that he is. The question emerged after that was, could another reporter of a different background have done a different job or a better job, or what kind of job would anyone else have done? So I think the idea of diversifying the newsroom, not necessarily so that we have Indigenous journalists doing Indigenous stories, or we have Jewish journalists doing stories in Israel. It has to be more sophisticated than that. And my worry is that news organizations now, having been hollowed out by digital, the number of people involved in fact-based reporting in both North America and in Europe is something like 40% less than it was 10 years ago. What are those captains of media industry going to do to fill the news hole? Are they going to say, okay, well, we've got a Mandarin reporter, she can do Mandarin stories and fill the time? We also need to remember that journalism is still about evidence-based reporting. Opinion, which has become much more prominent recently because it's easier and cheaper to do than setting up a bureau in Baghdad, means that a lot of news organizations are moving away from fact-based reporting and are relying on this kind of, they're glorifying subjectivity. And I think what I worry about, and I think Tom Rosenstiel worries about, is that we could get caught by providing less substantial information if we go down one particular path. At the same time, we're obliged to create a different set of values inside our news organizations. And that's a challenge. It's a good thing I'm not in management anymore.
I do. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to jump in and just push back a little bit, Jeffrey, because I work with young journalists all the time. And, certainly the state of the news media now, we are, very driven by a lot of, there's sections of it that are first person, that are opinion driven. I think it's, I think it speaks to new models of journalism, new approaches to journalism. Lots of people who are leaving traditional journalism spaces for newsletters and having that a different kind of engagement, a more direct reporter to audience as opposed to a reporter that's part of a traditional news organization. But one of the things I think it's important to acknowledge is that many people are leaving those spaces. I mean, I think the flight is going in different directions. You have a lot of right-wing commentators, Alex Jones types moving into platforms like YouTube. I think you also have a lot of journalists of color, for instance, who have left traditional institutional media because they were not given the opportunities to do investigative journalism. They were not given the jobs as feature reporters, that they often were shut out of opportunities for promotion and growth. So I also think that I don't know that I think that that there is this direct line between young people and moving away from sort of credible, critical journalism. And I also think that the people that cover their own communities can often be the toughest skeptics. They can often be the people who ask the toughest questions, who feel in some ways more emboldened to be very critical. I mean, I see it amongst our own journalists that there can be a real robust coverage of issues within our own communities because there's a degree of comfort. So I think, I mean, I hear your point about moving towards a lot more, our journalism, there's a lot more point of view and a lot more first person writing within media now, but I don't know that it's necessarily a generational thing, or that it means that objective or traditional journalism, fact-based journalism, is entirely lost.
We could have a longer discussion on that.
And Adrian wants to jump in. I'm going to do that, and then we've got an audience question that I want to throw out as well.
If I can just say this, like, I think the frustration that a lot of racialized journalists feel is that they constantly, they're made to feel as if their professional bona fides are always being called into question somehow, right? And so, like, the very notion that the question as to whether an Indigenous journalist, can cover a quote unquote Indigenous demonstration objectively, like, it's preposterous, right? Like, it's a silly, ridiculous question. And that question is rarely, can a white journalist cover an Indigenous demonstration? Does a white journalist have, perhaps, I don't know, a bias towards the police or a bias towards the status quo? Like, are they able to deal with, deal with these kinds of complex issues? Why are the ability of a racialized journalist, why is that always up for debate? I've always found it very perplexing and very, very curious as to why it's even a question, right? I don't understand. I don't understand it.
May I ask, Adrian, who's asking these questions?
Well, an example, a senior journalist, right? A senior journalist in this country who has been, top of her game, she's been covering, the top stories of the day, and she's being questioned as to whether she can deal with a so-called Black demonstration in an objective manner, right? Like that.
My question to you is
her supervisor.
Well,
her supervisor
should be fired. I'll give you one more quick anecdote.
Yeah.
When I came to NPR as head of news, I was told by the man who hired me, Delano Lewis, African-American man, said, you have to do two things. You have to make the newsroom play nice with the rest of the company. You have to stop the race discrimination lawsuits. You have to introduce digital technology. There was a fourth thing, which I've forgotten. Anyway, so I went out and looked at who's getting hired. And it turns out that it was only white people that were being hired at NPR. I said, this has got to change. Uh-huh. I said, here's the way it's going to work. And I took this from the Detroit Free Press, the way they handled these kinds of issues. If you're a supervisor and you're hiring someone, you have to show over the next 12 months who you have interviewed and who you have hired, and their race-based statistics in the United States, which may not exist in quite the same way in Canada for various reasons. And I said, if after the first year, a larger percentage of journalists of color do not make their probation after 6 months, then you, the supervisor, will not get a raise this year. If this happens for a second year and there's no change, you're fired. And guess what? At the Detroit Free Press, suddenly there was this allowance of an emergence of journalists of color inside the Detroit Free Press and the chain that managed it. And we managed to do the same thing at NPR for a while. There's another story behind this, but we actually did raise the number of journalists of color at NPR from 4% to 28%.
And it's not a bad point. I mean, I've often had the same opinion, Jeffrey, about our quest to diversify newsrooms would shift overnight if we were to tie our managers' bonuses to their hiring of diverse candidates and the number of diverse stories that they had on the air.
Damn right.
I think we would see the thing change overnight if we were to do that. But I know that our audience has a lot of questions, and we also want to get to some problem solving here as well, and solutions. And I know, Anita, that you're keen to do that. So here's a question about Adrian's points about assets, about cultural background as being an asset in a newsroom, for example. How do we encourage the people around us to lean into those assets, given they may have spent their entire careers avoiding being seen as having those qualities and assets? Either Adrian or Anita, why don't you jump in on that?
I think I mean, before you can even ask that question, you have to ask establishment legacy media outlets in Canada why they aren't hiring like people from underrepresented communities, including racialized journalists from the LGBTQ2S community. Because I understand that completely. I mean, it's not the responsibility of the individual journalist to, take on systemic barriers on their own and kind of shore up. I mean, like I'm a resilient person. I'm a confident person. And I think a lot of like my own career success had to do with the fact that I was able to really step into my own power and acknowledge my own assets. But that was a long journey that I did with the support of, after going to the US to cover the last US presidential election. And it was a different kind of environment and ecosystem there where I felt really supported. I saw myself in media. There was a lot of, both institutional and grassroots support for journalists of color. And so that is something that needs to be mainstreamed here in Canada before I think a lot of journalists of color can really step into their assets. And that's not a victim mentality. That's just, if you're continuously through generations told that you don't bring value, or like Adrian said, that your assets are called into question, it's very challenging for many people to overcome those barriers. And it's not a victim mentality. It's not, we're not talking about handouts. It's fundamentally about equity.
Adrian, if I could, you're teaching a course at Carleton this year. I wonder if I could ask you this: if you had a young student ask you how they go about checking their assumptions when it comes to reporting on diverse communities, what would you advise them?
Check on their assumptions. Can you elaborate?
I mean, if they were to, Rachel talked about cultural competency. If we were to go and cover the Indo-Canadian community, and we're not from that community, how should we go about making sure that we do so both in a respectful way, but also recognizing our own biases, our own unconscious biases that we may not even be aware of?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is that you have to bring your curiosity, which is always vital, and you have to be willing to listen. And you have to bring your humility. You have to bring a certain kind of respect for the stories and experiences of others. You have to be willing to sometimes make mistakes, and not be discouraged, not be dissuaded from carrying on, because the fact is that we are all fallible. We all make mistakes, but you have to have a certain kind of resilience as well. So those are the kinds of things that I would, I think the kinds of qualities that are necessary, but certainly deep listening, and really trying to pay attention, and doing research, doing the kind of study that's required to become competent in any kind of endeavor, right? Like you have to work, and you have to sweat. Yeah.
Rachel, in that same vein, if you talked about the view from nowhere at the beginning, and objectivity kind of being this wide angle lens of being neutral and detached. If you were to do the reverse, and so, for example, in Candace Callison and Mary Lynn Young's book that came out this year, Reckoning, they say that we should have a view from somewhere, actually, that people need to locate themselves. How could a reporter still represent to their audience that they are truth telling, that they are going through a process of fact verification, but locate themselves in a way that doesn't open them to a charge of bias or subjectivity?
I mean, I think transparency, I don't know who brought it up at the beginning, but I think when we talk about the values we want to bring to our journalism, everyone on this panel has, talked about values that I think are so key. So curiosity, deep listening, transparency. So I think part of it is just being honest about the process. I mean, one of the, a recent, close to home example for the CBC folks is Connie Walker's Finding Clea, her extraordinary multi-part series searching for the cause of the death of a girl, Indigenous girl who was brought into the foster care system. At different points in that, Connie would stop and like she'd be talking and she'd be doing an interview and it was, very documentary style, and she would stop and say, someone is telling me something and I'm not sure that I'm the best person to hear this. I'm not sure that it's about a personal family thing. And she would stop the recording. And then she would come back on and say, okay, so that happened and now I'm off doing this. Or she would say things like, I'm about to go into this community center, but they're in the middle of some sort of celebration and I wanna be careful before I go in. So it was almost like she was talking out loud during her reporting and being open about some of her journalism conundrums. Am I the right person to be receiving intimate details about a family matter without having the family with me? Pause, stop the tape, carry on. And I think that is a really brilliant way and a really brilliant model to have more transparency in our reporting process. I mean, one of the things that, digital journalism allows us to do is to have, footnotes and pop-ups where you can give a bit more background on screen. You can actually link to primary documents. So you can cite a court transcript and you can, hover over and you can see the transcript. So I think it's employing techniques like that where I'm doing a course right now on membership programs. And one of the things that audiences said in one study was they want journalists to be real with them. Mm-hmm. And by that, they're not saying, and what they're saying is just be honest, like tell me where you're coming from and I'll figure it out. Be credible, do the reporting, show your work, be honest about where you come from. And so I think that in a way, digital publishing, that kind of intimacy in journalism, that movement away from the voice on high, a kind of a unilateral, and I know this is work that Anita has done a lot of work around different models of journalism. I think having more of that engagement actually keeps journalists honest, and it encourages a dialogue where we can show people where we're coming from and what we believe. We can show them our work. We can show them our thought process. And we can also be very transparent about our errors. This is what I did wrong. And this is how I fixed it. And this is how I got it wrong. And I think that is so key to good journalism.
So Rachel is kind of talking about transparency as being a way to balance this, to balance these two competing issues. Sorry to make it binary, Anita. I mean, I know you're right. I don't know that it necessarily is, but seeking some sort of balance between having a personal perspective. But I mean, these are not abstract conversations for reporters who are going out every day. So Jeffrey, let me ask you. I mean, should a reporter be able to go and participate in a Black Lives Matter protest, for example?
Oh, this came up
on their personal time. On their personal time,
Well, this is a really important question. And we wrestled with this after 9/11 at NPR. There were a lot of demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations all around the United States. And NPR, in my opinion, could have done a better job in reporting that, but it didn't have the same intensity as the pro-war side, which was, of course, coming from the White House. And I had people come to me and say, I'm living in a small town. Everybody knows I work for NPR. I'd like to be in an anti-war demonstration. I said, well, as long as you're making it perfectly clear that you do not represent NPR, that you're there as a citizen, and you have the rights as a citizen to your opinion. But when high-profile NPR people whose faces are well known in the Washington, D.C. area came to me and said, I would like to be in a demonstration against the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I said, I think that's a problem, because you are on the air every day representing NPR and NPR journalism. I don't think you should go. If you feel really strongly about an issue, then ask for a leave of absence. And we had people at the CBC who were very much involved in various issues, mostly around abortion. And they wanted to be very active in that and still be working for CBC News. That's a problem. That is a real problem. However, if you feel strongly enough that you hate the idea of abortion and you want to go out and advocate for that, you know, maybe you should go off and do that, and maybe we'll see if there's some other job for you when you come back. The CBC used to have, I don't know what they do now, they had a very strict rule about CBC News employees being involved in politics. They could go off and run for parliament, but when they came back, they'd probably get a job in the library, not on the air.
And so there's, with all due respect, though, I mean, talking about participating in political rallies is a little bit different than talking about participating in something like Black Lives Matter. And so let me ask the very high profile guy that, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, Adrian, but I mean, you, I suspect, had to wrestle with this summer. What kind of, could you take us through your thinking process there?
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with Jeffrey. I don't think that you can participate in the demonstration. I think that it would call into question your credibility. It's a difficult one. Because I'm saying this is about our humanity, isn't it? Right? Like this is so. You know what I would say is that I think that there needs to be more space within our media organizations for criticism, and there needs to be more space for not necessarily demonstrating against our media organizations, but there needs to be more space for debate and questioning. I think that's what I would advocate for. But in terms of joining a demonstration, I don't think so. No, I wouldn't join a demonstration.
Anita, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is what you were going to say, Duncan, but when you were trying to make the distinction between a political rally and like Me Too or Black Lives Matter or a climate crisis march, I see those two things very differently. In fact, I myself participated in the Me Too march that happened 2 years ago. And I grappled with it a little bit, but it really wasn't a difficult decision for me to make because, like Adrian said, a lot of these issues actually have to do fundamentally with the humanity of these underrepresented groups. So if we're like, why is that a politicized issue? Like, I mean, it's even in our Constitution to respect the rights of these people. Abortion is another issue entirely, but I don't see how as a journalist, I'm also a citizen. And so if folks' rights are being taken away or challenged, I feel like as a citizen, I think it's totally within my rights to participate. I wouldn't necessarily advertise the fact that I'm a journalist at the demonstration, but I don't think that would
what
my
about
ability to report rigorously and accurately on that issue.
So, but if you were to pick up on Rachel's point about transparency, you may not advertise that you're a journalist at the march. What about if you were to cover a story about sexual assault? Is it something that you would feel the need to share with your audience?
Yeah, I think I would definitely contextualize it. I mean, this is a personal decision, but I might actually remove myself from the story if I feel particularly passionate. But if it's a story about sexual assault, then I would contextualize it and I would be transparent about the fact that I attended.
is there a way to codify that? And so I asked that as an honest question because I happen to know that CBC is going through a process of reevaluating its journalistic standards and practices with some of these questions in mind. Is there a way to codify some of what you're talking about rather than just leaving it up to individual journalists?
I use our constitutional values as a guiding light oftentimes. And so if this is, and because I always go back to the fact that media is a pillar of democracy, and those are the rights that we're indirectly defending by, producing quality public service journalism. So that's, if we were to codify it, and this is just me brainstorming just immediately in response to your question, it'd be like, okay, if there are issues that call, if it has to do with the humanity of folks and like human rights, then I feel that could be a framework that you can start to build a code around. I don't have all the answers, but I feel like that's a good starting point.
Duncan, can I say, like, as a host, you have a lot of privileges, right? And I appreciate the privileges that I have, but I also think that there are limits as well. And you can't do everything that you necessarily want to do, and you can't have everything. And so, and you have to be concerned about the perception of the audience, seeing you participate in what they might believe to be a political demonstration. And I think that yeah, like I'm saying that I might have my own personal views and my own kind of personal commitments, but I think that because I am an ambassador for the organization, I have to be mindful of that, and I have to be very judicious in the decisions that I take, and it's a sacrifice, and perhaps I'd like to be there, but perhaps I can demonstrate my commitment, in other ways. But I don't think physically being there, I'm not sure if that would be the most prudent thing.
I want to quickly respond and just say, I think it depends on who your audience is. And as somebody who works at CBC, I'd like to look at the data of like what the audience demographic breakdown is, but somebody mentioned in the comments, I think Colette Bryn mentioned the distinction between CBC's audience and the discourse's audience. They might call into question our integrity if we don't take a stand on fundamental issues like human rights that are very dear to the hearts of those in our audience. So I think it really depends, and I think there's space for all of that, which is, which actually I would love to talk more about solutions, because I think there's a lot of solutions around collaborations between outlets that are more establishment and emerging outlets that serve these underrepresented communities.
Rachel, you wanted to go.
Yeah, I also want just to quickly say, I don't know if other folks saw this, but the BBC recently just passed some new standards around its own journalistic ethics policy. And one of the outcomes is that, that what it looks like is journalism staff at the BBC will not be allowed to attend Pride Day. That Pride Day is seen as political. So even in their downtime as an individual, whether they are queer themselves or whether they're friend, family member, ally, they cannot go to Pride Day. And it looks like this will also extend to things like going to a Black Lives Matter event where you might just be there to watch. And again, a Black Lives Matter event could be everything from a march to a vigil. And I would say that there is distinction. But one of the things I just want to say around the BBC's decision is that so many of these journalism outlets that may frown upon their staff engaging in like going to a Pride Day, try to also get more viewers or audience around Pride Day by programming around Pride Day, by wrapping a building in rainbow flags, but then to deny their staff the ability to go to Pride. To me, I find it very disturbing that the BBC would say that it would be divisive to have its journalism staff attend Pride. I think that crosses a line into, I think that is wanting a standard of the appearance of objectivity and actually limiting people's rights to engage in their downtime, to participate with their communities at an event.
It's just a real downer that the BBC would say that you can't dance to the village people in the streets. I mean, that
Well, especially because Trump was
just takes
dancing to
stiff
the
upper
village
lip to
people.
another
I mean,
another level. It's so unnecessary. But we're getting we've still got a bit of time. There's a couple more questions, but it seems that we're getting to as we talk about journalists attending, whether it's Pride Day or Black Lives Matter, where, Jeffrey, would you draw the line between activism and journalism, which seems to me to be part of the concern of some of the conservative commentators when it comes to this question of objectivity?
Well, it's also a function of the individual journalist and how they feel about the events that they've covered. I've had a number of senior journalists, usually foreign reporters or producers, who have been kind of burned out by the stories that they've been forced to do. And one of the great field producers back in the day at the CBC, Wavina Belmonte, was at the London Bureau. She covered more wars than almost anybody else, with a whole bunch of different foreign correspondents. And I happened to be coming back into Israel from Gaza. That's another story. And there was a UN car, and a hand came up and waved at me. I thought, I don't know anyone in a UN car. When we got to the Israeli side and cleared customs, it was Wavina. And I said, she got out of the UN car, big Volvo. And I said, what are you doing now? Because I'd lost track of her. She said, I couldn't take it anymore. The idea of covering the misery of people again and again and again, I had to do something more. So I quit the CBC and I've joined the United Nations Refugee Relief Organization, UNHCR. And I've known some other people who have just said, journalism is an inefficient and insufficient way to cover the human condition. I want to do something else. And I have to say that I have to applaud them for doing that, because this is what you people are doing. I'm now sort of officially retired in a way, but what you people are doing, you are on the front lines of a terribly powerful, ongoing, daily assault on yourselves. And you need to figure out ways in which you can look after yourselves better, and you get management to help you look after yourselves. This is, to me, is the great untold story inside media organizations in a digital culture, where the digital culture has hollowed out these news organizations to such an extent that people are not feeling protected, nurtured, and supported.
But we're also, I mean, we've just finished the Trump era in the United States. I mean, this is also a time when people are being ever more critical of our bias as they see it, and turning away from journalism. And so we're needing to validate ourselves to our audience in many ways, which is part of the challenge, which is why we need to continue having these conversations. Adrian, let me direct this audience question to you, just because you have, I have to say, I applaud you for the way that you have consistently spoken up about lack of diversity in newsrooms and been open and candid about that. We've got a question from an audience member. I'm always worried about hurting people's feelings and wondering what they will think of me if I insistently complain about lack of diversity in media. How do I tone it down or get over this and become a strong leader?
Turn 50.
I have a,
I think
Adrian, that doesn't work. I promise you, it doesn't work.
I'm there in a couple of weeks. You know, I think it comes with time. I think we all come into ourselves. You know, we're all in the process of becoming, right? And it takes time for us to be able to, you know, articulate ourselves in the way in which we want to articulate ourselves. It takes time for us to sometimes be brave, right? It takes time for us to take certain kinds of risks. The truth also is that much depends on your positionality. You know, much depends on the role that you play sometimes within organizations. You know, the truth is that I have some privilege. You know, I have been a host at CBC now for 14 years, and not that that makes me indispensable, you know, because it certainly doesn't, but it does mean that maybe I have a little bit of currency. I have a little bit of power, you know, and also, you know, I feel connected to a community as well. You know, I'm part of a community outside of the CBC, and that also gives me strength, and that also gives me a certain kind of power sometimes, where I feel that I can do certain things. You know, and also, you know, I'm coming from, you know, a particular kind of tradition as well. You know, my parents were journalists back in the 70s for the main kind of Black Canadian newspaper, English language newspaper called Contrast. They were both columnists for Contrast back in the 70s. So that also perhaps gives me an advantage. It makes me feel as if I'm standing on the shoulders, you know, of my parents, right? So that also gives me a certain kind of drive. But again, you know, give yourself some time. You know, give yourself some time. Don't be so hard on yourself, and allow yourself to evolve and to come into yourself. That's all I would suggest.
Rachel, if I could lob out one more tough one to you, language that we journalists use is also so important in this discussion of objectivity. When it comes to words like land defender and versus protester, or survivor versus former residential school student, or victim versus survivor in a sexual assault context, for example. What kinds of discussions need to be had in newsrooms about race when it comes to covering BIPOC communities, or gender when it comes to covering trans communities, for example? Can you give us a sense of what you're seeing there?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I think it's, I don't know that you know, the rule that we employ in our newsroom when it comes to identifiers is we allow people to identify themselves how they choose to be identified. So, or how they, you know, what their identifiers are. So it starts with that. But I think it's these nuances which can be incredibly, incredibly important. And I'm really glad you raised this, Duncan. I think it's even like passive language, again, getting back to this idea of the view from nowhere. I'm going to plug, I wrote a book a couple of years ago. I'm not really trying to plug it, but it was about boys. And I wrote a
book. I'll plug it. Go buy it.
Thank you, Duncan.
Boys,
Thank you. Thank you for that setup, and I'll give you part of the royalties.
I second that. I read it. It was great.
But one of the things when I was doing research on my chapter on education, one of the things I looked at was bias in education, and looking at particularly Black and Indigenous boys in school systems. And, you know, there's lots and lots and lots of research looking at how punishment is unequal, and where harsher punishments land on certain kids. And I remember reading someone who is a scholar in this area, and they said it's often, the language that's often used is Black boys and Indigenous boys are more likely to be suspended. They're more likely to be expelled. But that just leaves this big, vague nowhere. Like, it's a passive framing. So some unknown force, or for some reason, they're more likely to be suspended. It often raises just that bit of doubt about, well, what do those boys do? You know, instead of framing it as principals, teachers, and administrators are more likely to harshly punish Black and Indigenous boys. Same fact, but it's a different way of framing it. One puts it as an active force. There are active principals, teachers, and administrators who are meting out punishments differently. And it's a small language switch, but when I read that, it really helped my thinking. It was like, right, It is putting the action of that oppression, and it's pointing out who is responsible for it. That these boys aren't just somehow randomly being punished. There are people making choices to punish these boys. So then the question is, why are those educators punishing these boys? Not why are these boys being punished? And I think it's just those choices around language are key. We saw this recently with, I think it was the Philadelphia Inquirer, where they did a story about after some of the protests this summer, some buildings had been damaged. And the headline they wrote were "Buildings Matter Too," or something like that. It was something that was incredibly insensitive and thoughtless. And it was very painful for many folks in the community in Philadelphia, very painful for many people in the newsroom at that paper. And it was one of those things where if you are not putting thought into your display, if you are not pausing and thinking, how is this display landing? And also, who is the implied audience for this? Who am I speaking to when I say this? Am I speaking to an audience I assume is white? Am I speaking to an audience I assume is Black? Am I speaking to an audience I assume is mixed? And so I think it's that kind of, is your language explaining as though people are not a part of the community that you're talking about? Is your language phrased in a way that is including the communities that you're talking about? So I think I don't know if I have a hard, fast thing, just that I think these conversations need to happen constantly in newsrooms when it comes to display, when it comes to captions, when it comes to the choice of the photos you use. Who are you running a mugshot for? Who are you running a shot of somebody looking like a full human being? Those sorts of things, those things matter so deeply when it comes to credibility and trust. And I would say objectivity, because if we're going back to this idea of you want to be truthful, every journalistic choice is coming with a bias or a choice. You're choosing what is the top story? What is the most important story? What story should lead? Those decisions are not made nowhere. They are made somewhere by somebody. So I think that's really, those conversations need to happen all the time. And I know we're running out of time, but can I just ask, I know Anita, I want to hear about solutions journalism and some of these approaches to doing better as well. So I'm hoping we'll have a moment to talk about that.
Yeah, so absolutely, Anita. Why don't you kick us off? And each, I'd like to hear from everybody. What's the most important thing that newsrooms across this country need to do right now in terms of tackling this question of objectivity?
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thanks, Duncan. I think a lot of the I coach and also teach a lot of startup media outlets as well as legacy executives from legacy outlets. And something that I always recommend is subverting the traditional model of journalism that's very top down and hierarchical. It's a small group of largely homogenous people, usually white, cis, straight men, making decisions about the stories of the day and then calling that objective. So subverting the model, making it community driven, consulting with community on an ongoing basis, entrenching that as part of your editorial process is essential. And all good journalists know this, to follow up with your sources, but having that actually be entrenched as part of the process will really fill in gaps in coverage. And another thing that I also want to mention is collaboration between journalism outlets. I often give this anecdote. It's my favorite example of collaboration in journalism between the Detroit Free Press and Bridge Detroit, which is an engagement journalism outfit, as well as Outlier Media, which is also a text-based engagement journalism outlet. And so Detroit Free Press actually found that much of their audience was actually largely in the suburbs, which were made up of affluent white people. And that their audience, that they weren't even covering stories that were relevant to the core of the city, which was largely racialized. So in order to fill in gaps in that coverage, it's really significant because Detroit is 80% Black. And so they were not serving 80% of the city. So what they ended up doing was partnering with two engagement outlets, Outlier Media and Bridge Detroit, that are populated exclusively by people of color to fill in those gaps. So this doesn't have to be an either or proposition or like have culture wars or legacy versus emerging media. I think there's tons of room for collaboration between individual journalists as well as institutions to fill in those gaps. And another thing that Rachel mentioned with solutions journalism, which is pointing to, rather than kind of always obsessively pursuing, if it bleeds, it leads, pointing at illuminating paths forward for solutions. And basically, solutions journalism essentially is surfacing existing solutions to systemic issues. So rather than constantly pointing out problems, which can feel really demoralizing to the public, actually surfacing solutions that have actually, pointed to progress is another approach that you can take.
It's something that I would love to see Canadian media do more when it comes to covering Indigenous communities. Jeffrey, in about a minute, what do you think newsrooms should be considering right now on this matter?
They need to invest in their journalists and not invest so heavily in the technology. The technology has become an excuse for avoiding investing in their journalists. This is a labor-intensive event, journalism. And part of the problem with the digital culture, in my opinion, is that it gives the veneer of credentialism to people in management. Oh, we know so much about the technology, we must be professionals. Well, in fact, journalism is a craft, and it has professional aspects to it, but it's essentially a craft. And news organizations need to deepen that craft value inside their organization in order to serve their audiences in a more effective way. End of sermon.
Adrian, are you hopeful about the conversation that's been sparked this summer about questioning objectivity or rethinking objectivity?
Yeah, I am, and I'm saying I'm seeing changes within my own workplace. So yeah, I am hopeful, and I do think that there are a lot of possibilities. Just to quickly add to what Jeffrey was saying, I think recruitment obviously is important in terms of recruiting more diverse journalists and like getting people in, but we also have to focus on the people who are there right now. And unfortunately there are a lot of racialized journalists who, for a variety of reasons, end up leaving. They leave the industry. So we need to be consulting with people on a much more regular basis and finding out how they're doing, and also investing in them in terms of professional development. Like, where do you want to go? How can we assist you to achieve whatever particular goals you have? And I think that will do a lot to retain people, because retention is actually a real problem within our industry.
Last word to you, Rachel, and you're not allowed to plug your book.
I just want to say I'm really grateful for this conversation, and if I could ask a favor of like my absolutely brilliant co-panelists and you, Duncan, as well, for moderating so wonderfully. People shared lots of things, so I'm wondering if people could, put things on Twitter, or if there's some way where things people have cited, like articles or models. Adrian gave us a bit of homework before the session today of that thread, which was really, really helpful to set the groundwork. So I'm just hoping that anything that got shared, if we have suggestions of, great pieces about questioning objectivity or solutions journalism, or, some of these pathways that we could do better, I would love to share.
And I'll also say Denise Balkasun gave a talk at Ryerson University where she did some of that hard work for us and for me when I was preparing, and put together a number of articles. So if you go to Ryerson University, look up I can't remember the name of the lecture off the top of my head, but look up Denise's talk. It's an outstanding talk, and she put together a number of an excellent reading list that people may want to go to. I'll retweet it on my Twitter feed. But thank you so much. It's a late evening talk, and I know you've got families and probably haven't even eaten dinner yet. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time and this really thoughtful conversation. It's as Natalie said at the beginning, our principle that it is timely. And I know, just judging by the conversation, I'm sorry to our audience, some of you left longer comments than I was able to read through. So I didn't share everything, but thank you to our audience for participating. I also want to thank my fellow fellows who helped out in terms of organizing this. Of course, there's several Southern Fellows at Massey College this year, and Keith Guerin and Leslie Young and Naba Duncan were all a big part of putting this panel together. So thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, and this is obviously a conversation that's ongoing. So you're welcome to take a look at our the Massey College YouTube page and share this conversation, and hopefully it was helpful to all of you. Thank you very much for listening to all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.